Chris Kobach, who's the Secretary of State in Kansas. I think he's running for governor. Also now we know a paid columnist for Breitbart, the conservative website, put out an article on Breitbart claiming that this fact that there are these out-of-state licenses voting is a sign of voter fraud. But you're not required.
He did more than that.
He
said it's he said it shows
being generous.
He shows that Maggie Hassan should not have won last year's Senate election because the margin of victory in that race was only 1,000 votes or so.
Right, assuming you would know how all those people voted.
There's lots of assumptions baked into that.
And then this initial Breitbart column and the data is now echoed around the sort of conservative talk radio world and various websites. And so this commission is coming into town next week. And I think Bill Gardner was hoping, and he's on this commission. And I've been very critical of that on the show. I think he was hoping that this would be sort of an opportunity to kind of move the argument forward in a nice sort of reflective way. But we now have a statement from Jeanne Shaheen and Maggie Hassan telling Bill Gardner that he should step down from the commission because it may endanger his legacy. I've said all along that, this is just a really problematic exercise any way you look at it. Whatever comes out of it is just, I don't think it's going to really solve whatever issues there are with any voter confidence. And plus, we've been over this issue of voter fraud. There's no systemic evidence. And I've said before, it seems like this whole commission is a function of Trump trying to sort of reverse engineer an explanation for why he lost the popular vote.
Back to those driver's license numbers that Dean started off with, those 6,500 people who voted in last year's New Hampshire elections registering with out-of-state licenses. There's a lot we don't know about those people. We don't know if they're still in the state necessarily. We don't know how they voted, certainly. But one thing we do know, and I think it's important to remember this, Dean touched on this, there's no requirement that you have a New Hampshire driver's license to vote in New Hampshire. There's no requirement that you register your car in the state to vote legally in New Hampshire. College students, out-of-state college students who are registered in a New Hampshire college can vote legally in New Hampshire, and they can register to vote with an out-of-state license. So there's absolutely no evidence that of those 5,000 plus people who voted with an out-of-state license, registered with an out-of-state license, and have not since registered, secured a New Hampshire driver's license, cast illegal ballots. There's actually no evidence of that at all, and any implication is just really irresponsible.
Right. Under the law, you can be domiciled here for purposes of voting, but be a resident of another state. Large numbers of, if you look at, I think NHPR has a useful diagram you can probably find on the website about, sort of where the out-of-state licenses were typically used. It's typically places like Durham,
college
Hanover,
towns.
Manchester. Yeah.
So those folks, if you're a college student, from an out-of-state enrolled in a New Hampshire university or college, you are perfectly within the law to register to vote on Election Day or whenever with your out-of-state driver's license, and there's no requirement that then you upgrade that license to a New Hampshire license at any time.
Our number, if you'd like to join this conversation, is 1-800-892-6477. And let's go to the phones and talk to Stephanie from Portsmouth. Stephanie, thank you very much for calling in. What's your question or comment?
Thanks so much for taking my call. So I grew up working the polls in Durham, and I can tell you that I find these numbers grossly misleading.
Which numbers, Stephanie?
The 6,500 number, suggesting that all those people don't have ties to New Hampshire or are voting out-of-staters voting in New Hampshire. That statistic I have seen now circulating on the blogs and in reports across New Hampshire today. And characterizing those voters as out-of-staters is just unjust. It's wrong. In many cases, those are students. They're spending more time in New Hampshire than they may be spending in the states where they were born or where they came from. And ultimately, I think this is yet another attempt to provide justification for a misguided witch hunt of a commission to try and prove voter fraud when we know there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud in New Hampshire. So I just wanted to, having had the perspective of working the polls in Durham, watching what it means to young people to get to show up and register to vote on the same day, what that means for voter participation, the idea that now 6,500 people are characterized as out-of-state voters, that's just false.
Well, Stephanie,
they're in New Hampshire. They're allowed to vote here.
Yep. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Appreciate your perspective. Let's also talk to Jerry Nurk in Freedom, who's a state rep. Jerry, thank you very much for calling in. What's your question?
Sure. Thank you very much. It's actually Jerry Knurk, and I'm
about that.
State Rep from Freedom. And this story does not have to do specifically with the 2016 election, but I'm sure that it affected thousands of people we lived in Massachusetts in 2006. Our son started going to UNH in 2006. We moved to New Hampshire in 2007. Though I wasn't able to contact him this morning to find out if he voted in 2008, I would suspect that he probably did. And he did not have a car, so he didn't register a car. He was not driving a whole lot. He didn't change his driver's license. He graduated in 2011, and like many young people, wandered about for a while, living in New Jersey, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, and then ultimately bought his home in southern New Hampshire in 2016. He's a New Hampshire resident. He was a New Hampshire resident when he voted. And I think that, again, echoing what the previous person who worked the polls down in that area just had to say, this is no sign of voter fraud. He always wanted to be back in New Hampshire, but as a young person, he had some other things he had to do with work.
Understood. Okay, so Jerry Knurk there making the separation between what it means to have a driver's license and what it means to actually be a resident here in New Hampshire. Jerry, thank you very much for giving us a call. So yeah, I mean that's one of the issues at the heart of this Kobach article that's gaining traction in right-wing circles, right? That there's some kind of conflation between having a driver's license and having a legitimate interest in voting here in New Hampshire.
Well, it's sort of another gloss on a line we heard shortly after Election Day last year from many folks on the right, including, I believe, Stephen Miller, an advisor to President Trump, that, in their words, there is a well-known tradition of Massachusetts folks being, quote-unquote, bussed into the state on Election Day, casting illegal ballots and then being bussed out. That claim was widely debunked across the aisle in New Hampshire by folks in politics. I think this... we're hearing this is the commentary on the right coming out of the release of this number seems another version of that, pointing to data to presumably give it a little bit more quantitative heft. But I do think it's just important to make clear current policy, current election law in New Hampshire. There does not imply that there's anything nefarious in those numbers. There's a lot we don't know, but to jump to a conclusion that 5,000 people illegally out of state residents illegally voted on Election Day last year is really irresponsible based on what we know now.
Yeah, and the viral nature of this on social media, Twitter in particular, is just fascinating. The kind of aha moment among conservative outlets that there's 6,500 driver's licenses from out of state in New Hampshire. So this is a very kind of conspiratorial tone to the writing, but there's nothing illegal about it. And it's not really evidence of anything. It's just probably primarily college students voting.
And just to be clear, worth mentioning before the break that Bill Gardner said this had no bearing on last year's election.
He said he had no reason to believe that there was anything problematic about the outcome of our election.
All right, worth mentioning. So this is the weekly New Hampshire News Roundup.